Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. So we have a very limited time to speak on a vast topic. So hopefully this will act as an introduction to you, and you can contact me for further discussion or information. There's been some developments in relation to this in regards to IIIM as well, yeah, when we talk about terrorism and Islamophobia. So this is the topic for today. As mentioned, I will be giving about 40 minutes talk or lecture, and then about 5 minutes. I'll also be happy to look at responses in the chat box afterwards. Okay. So terrorism and Islamophobia, the intersection of these two very troubling concepts, if you like. So basically, the contents of the presentation will be as follows. We'll be looking at the definition of terrorism and Islamophobia, the contestation over the definitions. We'll be looking more at the contemporary manifestations of them, maybe the past 30 or 40 years, but we will look a bit at the history of Islamophobia as well. How did it manifest itself previously? I'll be giving some examples in relation to that, especially how it relates to Orientalism. Yeah? We'll also be looking at how we might want to counter Islamophobia and perhaps an anti-Islamic agenda on the part of some powers. Yeah? We'll also be looking at the example of the MyPCVE, or the Malaysian Plan of Action for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism. So this is much more of a plan that the country has, Malaysia has, at the level of the Ministry of Home Affairs in relation to our security agencies. Yeah? And how this might indirectly have a link to countering Islamophobia as well, although it is not mentioned specifically. And then we might, if we have time, we'll look at a bit of discussion and suggestions. Defining terrorism. If you look at the literature of the definition of terrorism, international law provides no clear definition for the term terrorism. It has political and ideological connotations. Yeah, as you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and we've had examples of this in history. I think probably the two most famous examples would be that of Yasser Arafat of the PLO and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Yeah, they were formally recognized as terrorists until the tide turned in the international community, and through negotiations as such, they were then identified as and relabeled as freedom fighters. Yeah? So the same way, perhaps you can argue for Hamas in Gaza as well today. So despite attempts of the United Nations, states have not yet agreed upon a definition of terrorism. But from all of the definitions that we have through different agencies, academic bodies, think tanks, and others, number of common elements emerge from these definitions. Yeah? That there is an ideological nature of the terrorist act, the fact that it is directed against a population that does not participate in hostilities, the victims, in the context of an armed conflict, the fact that the mere threat to commit a terrorist act is sufficient to define it as such, and finally, the fact that it aims at undermining a government or an international organization, notably through the destruction of its infrastructure. So these are some of the agreed upon elements in the various definitions. So if you look at the UN, for example, it states here a definition where any action that is intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants, when the purpose of such an act by its nature or context is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. So this is one such definition that I'm sharing. There's many, many others. Now, the intersection of terrorism and Islamophobia. So how does terrorism contribute to Islamophobia? That's perhaps one of the questions that we have. There are different ways of how this may intersect, actually. Now, in the recent decades, especially during the war on terror, after 9/11, 2001, and you can argue the day the war on terror officially ended with the departure of the American troops from Afghanistan. So about 20 years of a policy that had significant impact on the perception and representation of Islam in different segments of societies. Yeah? Notably, the war on terror led to the securitization of Muslims. Yeah? So the issue of Islam, the identity of Islam became securitized as a result of post 9/11 policies, consequences in relation to national and international security. So the securitization of Muslims happened through the normalization of Islamophobia. So the profiling and the representation of Muslims as terrorists was further exacerbated as a result of this. Not that it hasn't happened before, yeah, but especially after 9/11, the subsequent 2 decades after that, a significant securitization occurred. Now, this happened, for example, through legislation that hinders Muslim women's cultural and religious expression, minaret bans in Europe, cartoons mocking significant Muslim religious symbols just simply for mocking sake. So this happened in countries such as Denmark and France, for example. Yeah, the Jyllands-Posten in Denmark and the more famous French cases as well. Digital surveillance is now the new normal, and we all know about digital surveillance that was highlighted in relation to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. Yeah? So whether it is online or through the eyes of CCTV cameras everywhere, so there has been gradual securitization of Muslim identity. So the war on terror normalized the securitization of Muslims and regularized the existence of Islamophobia. I remember earlier, yeah, some people believe that after 9/11, there would be a renewed interest in Islamic studies or the study of Islam as a socio-scientific phenomenon. But there was some level of optimism that it wouldn't be biased or it wouldn't be subject to politicization and securitization. But unfortunately, the opposite had occurred. Yeah. So while there have been increase in the learning about Islam, but it is not necessarily for the right intentions. So there is a particular historical trajectory concerning Islamophobia, radicalization, and the war on terror. It has its origin within the temporality of Orientalism and wider racism or the fear of the foreigner, xenophobia, for example, that emerged during the European colonial era, which has remained intact in the post-war period. Again, these are examples of how they have manifested in the past, although what I have presented here will simply be a very little representation of it. So defining Islamophobia, if you look at the term Islamophobia itself, again, there have been different attempts at the definition of Islamophobia. The Council of American Islamic Relations defines Islamophobia as a fear, hatred, or prejudice toward Islam and Muslims that result in a pattern of discrimination and oppression. Furthermore, Islamophobia creates a distorted understanding of Muslims by Can't see my slides at the moment. And Muslims by transforming the global and historical faith of the tradition of Islam, along with the rich history of its cultural, ethnic diversity of its adherents, into a set of stereotype characteristics most often reducible to themes of violence, civilizational subversion, and fundamental otherness. Yeah? So this is a definition of Islamophobia by the Council of American and Islamic Relations. Now, this is, of course, in relation to Muslim minority situations. Islamophobia must also be understood as a system of both religious and racial animosity that is perpetuated by private citizens as well as cultural and political structures. So the actors pertaining to Islamophobia is not necessarily limited to individuals or groups. They can be entities, which includes the state. Yeah? And I'll be talking some of the very difficult aspects of how the state itself might choose to basically set up policies and decisions which render Islamophobia as a norm in society. The OIC, for example, defines Islamophobia as a combination of hate, fear, and prejudice against Islam, against Muslims, as well as against anything associated with the religion. So the representation of its culture, of its practices, and so on, including the masjid, Islamic centers in different parts of Muslim minority communities, the Quran, hijab, etc. It also constitutes hatred, stigmatization, racism, and discriminations in daily life, on media, at the workplace, in political sphere, etc. It rests in the mind and it reflects in attitudes and could be manifested through violent actions, such as burning mosques, burning the Quran, for example, vandalizing properties, abusing women wearing the hijab, or insulting the Prophet or sacred symbols of Islam. That is more or less how Islamophobia identifiable, how it manifests, which can be seen through different perspectives, statements, behavior, and gestures. Since the last 2 decades, Islamophobia, as I mentioned, keeps growing in some parts of the world, and this has been especially the case after October 7, 2023. There have been a spike in cases of Islamophobia in Muslim minority situations in Europe as well as North America. So this happens through intensive campaigns and public discourses disseminating fear of Islam, and through significant number of incidents targeting Muslims, mosques, Islamic attires, and Islam's most revered figures. I'm sure you followed the news over the past 3 or 4 days pertaining to the attacks in the US, in New Orleans, for example, and Las Vegas as well. Now, the term Islamophobia itself was a term that was conjured in a North American media, a newspaper at the time. I think it belongs to the conservative publication. So it's been taken over by another entity, but then it was known as Insight on the news in 1991. So this was the first time that the term Islamophobia was actually utilized. And then it became popularized and mainstream today. So Islamophobia, according to Routledge, Encyclopedia of Race and Ethnic Studies, is the irrational fear of or hostility towards or hatred against the religion of Islam or Muslims in general. It is primarily a form of religious or cultural bigotry, and people who harbor such sentiments often stereotype Muslims as a geopolitical threat or a source of terrorism. So it's always goes to that profiling element again, that somebody's religious identity, skin color is associated with a religion, and immediately reduced into the basis form of stereotype. Muslims with diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds are often inaccurately portrayed by Islamophobes as a single homogeneous racial group. So this is by Routledge Encyclopedia of Race and Ethnic Relations. If you look at Malaysia as well, we do have our own definition of Islamophobia. MAIS, for example, which identifies it as an anti-Islamic racism. I'm translating as I look at this slide here, because it both contains hatred towards religion and discrimination towards the adherents of that religion of Islam. Islamophobia is also translated as fear of Islam. Some people say an irrational fear of Islam. But as I mentioned again, it's not necessarily an irrational fear. It can also be an intended, a planned development to instigate fear in society about Islam. Besides that, it has a lot to do with anti-Islamic sentiments. And the phrase is especially used after 9/11. Yeah? So it really came to be a prominent term after 9/11. Now, as I mentioned, the history of Islamophobia itself is linked to Orientalism to a certain extent. Yeah. What we have here is a representation of Napoleon Bonaparte's excursion into Egypt in 1799 to 1801. So what happened with Napoleon when he basically colonized Egypt during that time was that he brought about 500 or 600 scholars from different disciplines into Egypt. And this is an artistic representation of it, which is categorized as Orientalist art. But the historical context of it was that the entire history of the Egyptian people and its civilization was as such written from the perspective of the French without local contributors. So the entire history of Egypt written from a French or colonial powers perspective. So this was the beginning of the industry of Orientalism. You can say the same perhaps for Islamophobia today. Depiction, reduction, and a perspective of Islam from the perspectives of non-Muslim, Western, dominant, hegemonic perspectives. Yeah. So during this time, the Orient and Occident were seen as geographical and cultural entities, which is again itself man-made. Both have traditions of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given reality and presence to each other. Edward Said, whose the term is usually attributed to, focuses on the consistency of the Orient as an idea despite or beyond any correspondence. Yeah? So the idea of an entire history of a people represented by a bunch of scholars who come from outside. You can think the same way as how the British colonial administrators wrote about Malay history and culture, for example, when they colonized Malaysia in the past, yeah, without any representation from the local people. So basically what Orientalism leads to our understanding is the fact that ideas, yeah, cultures and histories must be looked at or studied in configurations of power. Yeah. So you have to look into the idea that power has a lot to do with the definition, especially socio-scientific definition and categories. Yeah, is something that cannot be overlooked. Now, the history and contemporary Islamophobia. Orientalism is a specialized field of scholarly study that emerged in the 19th century, spurred by commercial and imperial penetration into Asia. And as I mentioned, France's adventures as a colonial power in Egypt in the past, and then in Algeria, very famously. It inspired a wave of Orientalist enthusiasm for North Africa's so-called exotic and picturesque qualities by painters and artists, Eugene Delacroix and others, which trivialized and eroticized by a host of minor painters as well, and expanded to other knowledge systems. Yeah. So while scholastic study expanded, so did racist attitudes and stereotypes of inscrutable, wily Orientals. The scholarship often was intertwined with prejudicial, racist, and religious presumptions. So this is just to give a bit of historical background in relation to how the manifestation of Islamophobia was made apparent prior to the popularization of the term Islamophobia. Yeah. And this was further expanded by other related terms. Yeah. Eastern political and economic systems were thought to be inferior. Yeah. And many critical theories regard Orientalism as integral to a larger ideological colonialism justified in the concept of the white man's burden. So this came together with the age of colonization and relevant ideas of modernization and development as well. And the fact that I'm learning and giving my lecture in English to you is, to a certain extent, a post-colonial legacy that we have inherited in terms of the linguistic mediums of knowledge. So again, this is something which is if you go back in history, in the Middle Ages, yeah, the idea of Islam as being demonized had also occurred previously, yeah, in different contexts, in the literature of the past, as well as in examples of historical experiences as well. How they have intended to represent Muslims and Islam in a negative way. And they also passed laws with which to lead to the persecution and expulsion of Muslims and even Jews at that time from Spain. So just an example again, in the Middle Ages. Of course, they weren't using the term Islamophobia back then, but this was seen to be a representation of such. Now, contemporary Islamophobia. Yeah. So there's been numerous reports, and the reports that I'm sharing here are excerpts from, I think, reports done in 2023 and 2024 from North America, from Europe, by the OIC's Islamophobia Observatory and other sources as well. Yeah. So I'll be happy to share the slides with you after this. This is just to share some of the excerpts from it. Yeah, so there was a spike based on the Council of American Islamic Relations in terms of complaints made. The highest number of complaints ever recorded in its 30-year history. So this is after October 7. Yeah? So just for the month of October alone. So this wave of anti-Muslim incidents surpassed the period following the implementation of President Trump's Muslim ban. So this is Trump 1.0. So God knows what to expect in Trump 2.0, especially after his inauguration as the president. So we again expect a new wave of Islamophobia to develop after this. So the main force behind this heightened Islamophobia in relation to the numbers reported was, of course, the October 7 attacks and the subsequent genocide of Zionist Israel on the Muslim population in Gaza. So these are some of the summary statements from the report. Islamophobia is more than hate speech. Islamophobia is on the rise. So this is for 2024. And Islamophobia doesn't just affect Muslims. It can affect other communities as well, indirectly, As you may remember, the first victim of post 9/11 retaliation in the US was actually a Sikh community member. Islamophobia is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yeah. So there are strategies of using Islamophobia as policy. And Islamophobia is most prevalent in schools, and this is not just for North America, but also in Europe as well. So they suffer forms of discrimination most prominently during the school years. So these are some of the summary points made from the report in 2023 and subsequently in the 2024 report as well. So these are some excerpts of contemporary Islamophobia in Europe in 2022. Yeah. So some examples here refers to France and Emmanuel Macron's systemic obstruction policy, which has led to the control of various Muslim institutions, the closure of some of them, and the blocking of their financial independence as well, based on the laïcité plan or secularism plan in France. Yeah. And in Britain, for example, there had been, after 9/11 and the 2005 terror attacks in London especially, they also had this campaign which was known as Prevent, which is their version of countering violent extremism, but it ended up targeting Muslim minority population for the most part. Yeah. So the British PM at this time largely ignored the fight against Islamophobia. So this was a British Prime Minister under the Conservative government at the time, defending Prevent's counter-terrorism strategy and vowed to refocus it on the threat of so-called Islamist extremism. So Prevent was identified as a failure in relation to the Muslim minority community. Yeah? Even the suggestion for an all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia in the British Parliament was rejected. Yeah? The definition of it was rejected. So these are taken from some excerpts of the Leopold Weiss Institute in relation to Islamophobia in Europe. And these are some of the breakdowns of the types of discrimination suffered. And of course, Islamophobia itself can be broken up into different categories, whether they are in the form of discrimination, provocation, and incitement to hatred. And these are the number of cases next to it in the European report. Degradation and desecration, insults, moral harassment, defamation, physical assaults, yeah, and incidents linked to the fight against radicalization and separatism. So it can include individuals, groups, and it can also include government policies and actions as well. And even in Europe, education still topped the list for the experience of Islamophobia. It usually manifests itself in high school. So this is a microcosm of society, if you like. Yeah? So this is already something that happens in schools, then it will definitely be something that will be extended in real life afterwards. To go quickly after this. And again, we tend to focus on Muslim minorities in North America and Europe, but the reality is that it also happens in the Asia Pacific. Yeah, there have been various reports pertaining to Islamophobia in this part of the world as well. Yeah. Most famously, of course, China. And the issue is still in existence, but it has, of course, to a certain extent, been replaced by the focus on Gaza as well as Syria as well lately. Yeah. There have been, of course, issues pertaining to the Muslim Rohingya population in Myanmar or Burma, and some elements of this was also manifested in relation to the Muslim population in the southern provinces of Thailand as well, and also in other countries, including the subcontinent, such as Sri Lanka as well. Yeah. especially after the Easter Sunday bombings. And these are, again, other examples. We do have a declared International Day to fight Islamophobia. And the date is the 15th of March. And the 15th of March was a day in remembrance of the Christchurch attack against the Muslim population there. Yeah? So it has been taken as a date for us to commemorate and also intensify our efforts to fight against Islamophobia. And these are, of course, incidents that happen in New Zealand. Skipping this part. There's a video that I'm sharing here, and this is really in relation to the typical misrepresentation of Muslims, especially their identity in Western popular culture. Notably, there have been some improvements in relation to the accuracy of the representation of Islam and Muslims. And here is one such good example. There's no time to share with you here, but you can look at it later as I share the slides. Now, countering Islamophobia has been taken up as an agenda at the highest level of international community. Yeah? So we have the United Nations General Assembly adopting 15 March as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, as I mentioned earlier. It calls, for example, a global dialogue on the promotion of a culture of tolerance and peace based on respect for human rights and the diversity of religions and belief. Even in the Asia Pacific, yeah, as they discuss the rising cases of Islamophobia in this part of the world, they also looked at the potential solutions, the body of work on counter narratives and strategies to combat Islamophobia in the Asia Pacific region, which covers, among others, the Agency of Muslim Women, their economic empowerment, monitoring of digital and online space, peace journalism, among others, as well as the existence of multi-faith networks and interfaith dialogue as well. Yeah. So in countering Islamophobia, it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to use the reactive label of Islamophobia, but it can be used to refer to more, I think, progressive and I think positive activities and notions as well. And these are more slides on countering Islamophobia in the European experience, as well as in the United States of America. So there's a continuous advocacy in relation to the experiences. So we're not just simply reporting the incidents of Islamophobia, but we're telling the governments, and we are also giving potential solutions. Yeah? So, for example, one such call was made for Congress to enhance anti-doxing laws. So, if you know what doxing is, it's about the basically looking into the background of a potential employee, for example, looking into his online behavior without his knowledge to find faults and whatnot. So it's breaking privacy law to that extent. Even in Muslim majority society, because a country like Malaysia is multicultural, we do have our sensitivities in relation to race and religion, and especially because Islam is also identified as a Malay Muslim identity. Yeah, so it's a combination of race and religion. We have to also look into ways to facilitate knowledge against Islamophobia and potential anti-Islamic agendas as well. Yeah. So we're very careful with the 3R, race, religion, and royalty. Some of these elements have Islamophobia in its writings, in its videos, and others. Yeah. And there are different considerations to be taken into account. The Prime Minister has, the current Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, has taken it as a serious issue, yeah, on the global level. But at the same time, he also talks not just about external Islamophobia, but the likelihood that intra-Muslim factionalism and rivalries themselves and the extremisms that is in existence in some of our communities or groups, these itself can reflect badly on Islam and contribute to Islamophobia. So it's not necessarily external misrepresentation and misperceptions, but it's our own activities as well that may have contributed to this perception. Yeah. On countering Islamophobia and possible anti-Islam agenda, I always go to this surah. This is Surah At-Tariq, yeah, which really calls for individuals and the collective ummah to practice steadfastness and resilience in da'wah. The surah itself came at probably the most difficult time of the initial mission of da'wah in the community by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he was asked to basically practice the steadfastness and patience despite the various attacks and discrimination that were felt by the Muslim community then. And you can have a look at the entire surah to look into the context of how the immediate call for action was actually in relation to steadfastness and patience. So we cannot be, I think, vicious in our response. We have to practice these principles when we are faced with such adversity as well. So there has to be wisdom in the way that we address Islamophobia through knowledge as well. I think there was a recent incident at Masjid in Taman Tun Dr. Ismail, and there were complaints that the person who infiltrated the mosque for Fajr prayer was actually physically assaulted to a certain degree. And this shouldn't have been the case in regards to how we facilitate counter-Islamophobic narratives and so on. And there have been very unique cases of how people who were the most vicious advocate of anti-Islam actually became Muslim reverts. Yeah? I think probably the most recent case is that of Van Claveren of the Freedom Party in Holland, which is a far-right extremist party. And he actually became a Muslim after he read the Quran and engaged with the Muslim communities and so on there. And he wasn't alone in the party. There was a previous figure as well, Van Doon, who was also formerly a far-right extremist, who was very vocal in his anti-Islamic agenda. But eventually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened their hearts to Islam. So it's not the eyes or reason that are blind, but it's the hearts. Yeah. So this is from Surah Al-Hajj 46. So now, he used to remember the activities of burning the Quran. So every time he burns one Quran, we give away 1,000. Now that is his response to right the wrong that he did during his time as an Islamophobe. Yeah. So these kind of minor miracles, you can say, really do happen in different societies. Yeah. But that is not necessarily enough, obviously, as a community, as an ummah. We also have to be systemic in the way that we address Islamophobia. Yeah. So we have to ensure that we practice the right governance in relation to this. So we have, in relation to this, from Surah Ash-Shura, verses or ayah 38 to 39. Yeah. So we have to also defend ourselves appropriately. And this may come in the context of laws, regulations, and enforcement. So, I'm sorry I have to go a bit fast because of the time. And in the context of Malaysia, we have had such policies or plans of action. And this was something that was launched late last year. I was a part of this policy and plan of action. And Islamophobia is not even mentioned as a word in relation to the plan. Because we have to take into account the sensitivity of multiracial population. So definitely, when we combat Islamophobia, it's not necessary that we say that we are combating Islamophobia, but we're trying to facilitate a situation where there is Islamophilia, or love for Islam, love, appreciation, and understanding of Islam. And this can come under the guise of nation-building activities, under the guise of inter-civilizational or inter-religious dialogue, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And further in relation to this is the fact that IIUM will also be creating a new entity which is known as the Center for Counter-Islamophobia and Global Engagement. The center has in fact been approved, and we will start to facilitate our activities in the years to come. So this will be IIUM's international attempt at addressing the issue of Islamophobia. So this is just to act as a introduction to the topic. You can reach me at danialmy@iium.edu.my. That's my phone number as well. And I'm happy to share the slides for you to go through again when you have the time. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.